I once went to this meditation class where this guy had a bit of a breakdown during the meditation. What happened was, room full of people, everyone's meditating, which is what you do in a meditation class. But all of a sudden this guy got really upset. Like, he started hyperventilating, he started crying. And this brought a pause to meditation because everyone in the room was concerned about him. Apart from, it seemed, the person who was leading the class. Because the person who was leading the class asked him what was wrong, and he revealed that ultimately, when he was meditating, he started to think about his daughter, who had recently died, his young daughter, and he was getting all these flashbacks to like how life used to be, and thinking about how, you know, it was so unfair basically that she'd died, which of course it was in many ways. And the woman who was leading the meditation class just looked at him and she said, "You're doing it wrong." Everyone was kind of stunned when she said this, but it really made me realize that a lot of the time people are using these kind of healing interventions like meditation and blah, 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 not to actually heal and to get in touch with this stuff, but to tranquilize themselves and to just numb out. About a week ago, I did a yin yoga session with one of my coaching clients, something that I do sometimes for people that are trying to cultivate stillness. And this guy had a great time. He got really into his breath. He felt a sense of peace. And at the end of it, he said, "I don't think I've ever been this relaxed in my life." That's literally what he said. And then he sent me a text the next day saying pretty much the same thing. But what I said to him in reply was, it's because you're not relaxed, you're regulated. And this made me realize that so many people are trying to relax themselves or tranquilize themselves, giving themselves a shot in the arm with meditation or whatever else. Not to get into their bodies and the present moment, but just to numb out, to escape, to distract themselves from whatever's going on in their lives. And in the long term, that's never a good strategy. Regulation is different to relaxation in this sense, because regulation is about balancing out your nervous system. And if you balance out your nervous system, you're going to be in a better long-term state to get into the flow of your own life, get into the present moment, do what you need to do to face life with trust and coming from a place of safety instead of threat. It's quite easy to meditate or to do any other kind of relaxing thing that tranquilizes you and get a short-term release, but to keep your nervous system overall in a state of being frazzled and worked up. If you get into regulation instead, and you do this consistently, then you're going to change yourself from the inside out instead of keeping yourself ultimately overall where you don't want to be from the outside in. So without turning this into a bit of a lecture, your nervous system basically has two branches. There's the somatic nervous system, which is responsible for voluntary movement. So right now, I'm choosing to move. I'm walking around. My nervous system's doing that. Move my hands, same thing. Then you've got the autonomic nervous system, which does things involuntarily, which means it's things like the way that your heart beats, the way that you breathe, the way that you react to things. That has two other branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is responsible for fight or flight. So basically perceiving threats, getting your body ready for action so you can do something about it. Your parasympathetic is what helps you to rest and digest. So to relax and to heal and do the things that you need to do. Both of them are important and you need both of them to work. But a lot of the time, people are stuck in fight or flight. They have something called sympathetic dominance. And so they're all worked up. These are the people, a lot of the time, that will try to tranquilize themselves with relaxation. But really, that doesn't change that nervous system state. And they stay stuck in fight or flight. And then they have to keep returning to these little tranquilizers to try and escape something that is actually much more fundamental. The tranquilization is where you try and trick your nervous system in the short term to thinking that you're relaxed. So use meditation, like in the first example I gave at the start of the video, to escape from your feelings, to pretend that you're okay, to tranquilize yourself, to numb out. The other way of doing it is to regulate, which is what my client did in the yin yoga session last week. You get your body into a state of regulation where your breath is slow and deep, where you feel safe, you feel at peace. If you keep doing that, and you do it over and over again, you build a foundation of regulation in your relationship with yourself, and then you feel much safer in the long term to do all the things that you need to do without having to take these little shots of tranquilization and relaxation. to make this even more complicated, maybe, a lot of people have what I call a sympathetic personality, which means that their whole personality is basically just a reaction to that fight or flight response that they're stuck in, because the sympathetic nervous system is in overdrive. It's a lot like if you drink coffee. If you drink a lot of coffee, you might be quite frenetic, you might have a lot of energy, like this, a bit erratic. And if you drink coffee for long enough, for enough years, you start to think that's you. But when you give up the coffee, you'll realize it wasn't you. That was the coffee making you act in a certain way. It's the same with the nervous system. So many of us are in a sympathetic state. We have this sympathetic personality. We think that's just who we are, but it's not. It's just us being in threat mode, survival mode, and reacting to all these internal and external threats that we see all over the place. This is really important when it comes to our personal growth, because if we're stuck in this sympathetic state and we're constantly seeing threats, even if it's just an unconscious thing, well, it affects the way that we relate to ourselves. We create this sympathetic personality unconsciously, but ultimately all that does is it makes us more attached to the ego. Because when the ego's in threat mode, when we're in threat mode, the ego seems more important to us. And so we put a little frame around everything that we experience, including our relationship with ourselves, what we're going to face within ourselves at an emotional level, mental level, spiritual level. And instead of being real and integrated and moving forward, we just stay stuck and frozen in this sympathetic version of ourselves, the sympathetic personality, which is just the ego in fight or flight mode. What happens then is that all of the real parts of ourselves that are hidden behind the ego in the shadow self never get an expression. And so ultimately, every time we take one of those tranquilizers to try and relax, not only are we delaying our healing journey, our real healing journey, we're keeping who we really are in hiding. Because it's almost like every time the shadow self tries to come up from the surface, we give ourselves another one of those shots in the arm, convince ourselves that we're relaxed, and then we go back into hiding. Short-term strategy, maybe that works, but in the long term, it's just keeping us where we don't want to be. The long and short of all this is that the ego fears regulation, because if we're regulated and our nervous system is aligned with life in the way that it needs to be, then we're going to have to face the truth about ourselves. And so this is a bit of a paradox, because it means if we've been unregulated for a long time, when we first start to regulate and find stillness and safety in the moment, we're going to have to face a lot of that underlying emotional stuff we've been hiding from, face the shadow self, all these kind of things. And the ego doesn't want that, because the ego is the opposite of reality, and regulation is returning us to reality. So we find ourselves in a difficult situation. Most people deal with it by just learning to relax, which really just means to keep escaping reality, but to find a basic sense of calmness within the confines of the ego and what it is going to allow us to face. If you think about it, the worst cases of relaxation become addictions and the things that keep us stuck in life. And it's because we normally turn to these tranquilizer relaxation methods as a way of escaping life without actually making changes in life. So think about alcohol, porn, weed, unhealthy sexual relationships with people that you don't even like, shopping, literally anything. All of these things, they give us a bit of a relief, but in the long term, they don't really change anything. And so the tension keeps building, and we become more and more dependent on these things, thinking that we need them to relax, when really they're actually making the problem worse. They're exacerbating it, because they're just helping us to prolong facing reality, building a foundation of acceptance, and then actually changing the life that we built for ourselves by taking different actions. And so if you have stuff like this in your life, there's a high chance that you're not where you want to be in life. Not that these things are bad in themselves. If you use them in moderation, or you see them as what they are, that's fine. But if they become a coping mechanism or a coping strategy for dealing with life, then in the long term, things are just going to snowball and get worse and worse. The reason things are going to snowball and get worse is because the only way they can get better is if you find a foundation of acceptance on which to start building your life. And if you're relaxing in this way that I'm talking about, where you're just tranquilizing yourself and numbing yourself to life, then you're literally not going to be able to face reality and find that foundation. And without the foundation, everything you do is just ultimately up in the air, and it can come crashing down at any moment. The earliest example most of us have had, in fact all of us do, of being in this regulated state is in the womb. Now personally, I don't remember much about that, apart from the fact that there weren't that many TV channels. The food was kind of the same all the time. But besides that, I was all right, because most of my needs were getting met. I was completely one with my environment, and I didn't really have to do very much in order to go with the flow. Obviously, we can't all go back to the womb, nor should we really want to, but when we start to regulate ourselves by learning to control our breath, feeling safe with our own emotional stuff, taking action that's real, and trusting ourselves and life to get where we need to be, we can kind of turn the world into our womb, which of course is a metaphor, not speaking literally, but what I mean is we can turn the world into a place where there's no threats, no unnecessary threats, where we feel safe, where we can just do what we need to do without holding and hesitating back, and where we can keep growing, where we can be born again, so to speak, every day, because we're not held back by the past and all of the ways that it's messed up our nervous system and caused us to see threats everywhere. Instead, we can just be responsive in the moment, move forward with life instead of against it. And really, that's all any of us want, to put ourselves in that zone of realness, where in the flow of life, because we're regulated, instead of being in the zone of unreality, ego, where we keep forcing things because we're resisting life and pushing it away because of what our dysregulated nervous system is showing us as a kind of filter between ourselves and life. An extreme example of turning the world into a womb like this is when you have a peak experience. When you put yourself in the moment with such vivacity that there's no line between you and life. For me, one that I always use as an example is when I was in Japan and I climbed Mount Fuji and I came down the next morning just bounding, taking these huge leaps, because the mountain on the way down is made of ash, so you can just jump and land in these big piles of ash and they all shoot up and the clouds were beneath me and everything. I felt totally alive. Another example is riding a motorbike or making love, or like any of these things where it's not like you're just observing life, it's like you become part of life. When I was bounding down that mountain, I wasn't Ollie Anderson, I wasn't thinking about myself, I was just there, I was just alive. It's the same thing when you regulate yourself and you live from that place instead of what the dysregulated sympathetic personality shows you. Trying to live in this way, where you're in the flow instead of forcing things through the sympathetic personality, is one of the reasons I tell my coaching clients to build this foundation of safety first and foremost. If you've built this foundation of regulation, instead of just relaxing from all the things that are stressing you out because they're unreal, you can kind of live as though life is a peak experience. Because you come from this grounded place, and then you create a vision for yourself, and then you start taking action on it. And day by day, you keep stretching. You stretch beyond the boundaries of your ego and what you think you know, and you get into this flow. You keep building momentum. You get to a place where life is evolving, and so are you. And that's all we want, to keep growing, keep moving. But you can't do that if you're stuck behind the ego and the sympathetic personality. There's a metaphor from yoga that I really like, from the Yoga Sutras. It says that who we really are, when we've been as real as we possibly can be, is awareness. And in the metaphor, it says that awareness is like a glass smooth lake. Just a lake with no ripples, totally calm, peaceful. That's us, that's the real you. The problem is, sometimes the lake gets ripples as the mind fluctuates, as things happen, as emotions rise, whatever it is. And occasionally, if we're not careful, we start to identify with those ripples instead of the lake itself. Regulation is what starts to return you to that awareness. Relaxation is just about dealing with a ripple, one ripple after another as it arises, giving yourself a little shot in the arm and trying to pretend it's not there, instead of looking at the deeper issue, which is that you become distracted and distanced and disconnected from your own core as awareness. Regulation is about returning to that, returning to realness, putting yourself in that flow of what's already there. That guy I spoke about in the meditation class at the start, he wasn't doing it wrong, like that woman said. Her nervous system was just out of regulation and she found her own emotions threatening, so she projected that onto that guy. What he was on the verge of was moving from beyond the ripples to the fundamental problem, which is a disconnection from ourselves and a return to that reality of awareness, realness, whatever you want to call it. It's the same for you in your own life. Regulation is about returning to a deep presence. The presence in yourself, so you can be present in the world and present in life itself. And if you tune into that, it's a game changer. And so if you find what I've been saying makes sense because you've just been relaxing, i.e. tranquilizing yourself, then I challenge you to spend at least a day, a month, or half an hour a morning, or whatever it is that works for you, cultivating that foundation of regulation. Find stillness first and foremost. Face yourself, be with yourself, allow whatever is going to come up. Feel it as just emotional discomfort rather than physical danger, and realize that you're safe to let it go where it needs to go. Emotions are energy in motion, emotion. All you need to do is stop resisting and to let them move. And it's the same with all of life. If you stop resisting it, it's going to move, and sometimes you can go with it to wherever you want to go. So that was a video about relaxation and tranquilization versus regulation. A lot of the time, we tranquilize ourselves to deal with the unreal life we built for ourselves because we've been avoiding ourselves. Regulation is about changing that, putting your nervous system back where it needs to be so you can face yourself and face life and start growing real. It's not easy, but it's simple. Nearly tripped over and died again. It's fine. It's not easy, but it's simple. Or it's not simple, but it's easy. If you slow down, get in your breath, let your body know that you're safe, then you realize that you are, and you can start building a life that feels real instead of just as an extension of that sympathetic personality, the ego hijacked by the nervous system. So I hope that helped you. Stay real out there, keep breathing, slow down, and stay real. Peace to you.